Mr. Speaker, today is National Human Trafficking Awareness Day. And what I'd like to do very briefly is just share a couple stories from some people I've had the privilege to know that have really been on the front lines on combating this scourge. One is a man named Dave Eubank. And I first met Dave for his work assisting people as part of an organization called the Free Burma Rangers. And he's done a lot of work in Southeast Asia. But when everything started to go down with ISIS in Syria and northern Iraq, him, along with members of his organization, to include his wife and his small children, actually went over to northern Iraq and were helping rescue women that had been trafficked to ISIS. This came to a head at one point where him and two of his members were out and they were receiving fire, and they noticed a young girl that was crying underneath the body of her dead mother. And Dave left cover and recovered her and brought her back. And that young girl, along with several others that they had rescued who had been trafficked, were provided medical aid and care and assistance with recapturing their lives by his wife and his children. Another man that I had an opportunity to meet who was a victim of some of the worst child abuse you've ever heard of when he was young, Victor Marks. Victor Marks does an incredible amount of work along with his wife and his family, rescuing kids from child abuse and rescuing kids that have been victims of human trafficking, to include going into some pretty dangerous places and working with law enforcement in order to do so. Victor was the one. When I heard David's story, it was easy to think that this was a overseas problem. Victor's the one that really opened my eyes to how much of a problem it is here in the United States. And there's been a lot of attention to this lately due to major motion pictures, and that's great. But one of the things I want everyone to understand, because I certainly didn't, I don't want to assume that anybody else does anymore, is how pervasive this really is, and how the United States is one of the biggest markets for it. And human trafficking, I think, sounds a little bit more sterile than what it really is, because if we're honest, it's a form of modern day slavery. And some of it's labor, and some of it is arguably even worse. And the way that it disproportionately affects vulnerable women and vulnerable children is absolutely obscene. And one of the things that amazed me about David Eubank, and a question I had to ask him, because David was a former Ranger, Victor Marks was a former Marine, and I remember asking David one time, I said, man, I know why you go and do it, but how do you bring your wife and children into situations like this where they're going to be put at danger too? And he looked at me and he goes, Nick, my family has made a promise that we will never be dissuaded from doing what God has called us to do in order to help the people that we are called to help by a desire for comfort or desire for safety. He told me that over 10 years ago, and man, it stuck with me as if he told it to me yesterday. Not all of us are going to be called to go into that sort of situation in order to help people that desperately need us. But there is a great deal that we can do within this body. And there are several members that have dropped legislation this year to specifically deal with this issue, to be able to provide resources, to be able to provide regulations, to be able to provide statutes in order to get help to the people that need it, to prevent it from taking place in the first place, to punish those who engage in such activities, and to do whatever we possibly can to make whole the people that have been victimized by this practice and this criminal activity. And so, Mr. Speaker, I know that there are many issues this session for which we will have disagreements and lively debate, but I do think this is one that all of us can stand in an act of solidarity in order to pass legislation which will equip the various law enforcement institutions, legal institutions, civic organizations, to be able to protect those that are vulnerable, save those that have been victimized, and punish those who have participated in these activities. So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that we all use this opportunity, not just on this day, to recognize the problem that this is and the power that we have to be able to effectively address it, but that we would remember through the rest of this session that it is within our power to make a significant difference and impact in this area. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.